When Eilat Mazar realized she discovered an ancient structure near Jerusalem, she turned to the Bible to help explain what she found.
Just outside the Temple Mount, she found more royal ruins, this time from David's son, Solomon.
In her final months, famed archaeologist Eilat Mazar whispered that there was something she couldn't publish, something she found beneath the palace of David.
I kind of frozen. It was amazing, unexpected. And I thought, oh, wow, so much gold. What am I going to do?
After her death, private notebooks surfaced, names not in her reports, sketches of sealed hidden chambers, and a line she wrote again and again.
She said, well, this is the uppermost point of the city of David, directly beneath the old city walls and the Temple Mount to the north of us.
What they don't want the world to know, was it just academic drama or evidence buried under royal foundations that could upend biblical history? Her final words, the truth she couldn't publish. In her final months, people who knew Eilat Mazar argued fiercely that she had lost her mind. Some said openly that she had gone mad. Cancer was destroying her body, but many close to her believed it was the secrets she carried that pushed her into breakdown. Neighbors claimed they could hear her screaming in the middle of the night, and not just once or twice. They said it happened often enough that people in her building were disturbed by it. Visitors to her home said she would sit for long stretches talking to herself in a low, agitated voice, as if she was locked in heated arguments with people no one else could see. These were not the ordinary struggles of a sick woman. To those around her, they were signs that she was being crushed by what she had kept hidden. Her physical decline was brutal. She lost weight at a shocking pace, and by the end, she appeared frail and almost unrecognizable compared to the strong, confident archaeologist the public remembered. But it was her behavior that alarmed her family and colleagues most. They described her pacing her apartment, muttering again and again about what they don't want the world to know. Those words stuck with people who heard them because they suggested she believed she was protecting a truth too dangerous to be made public. When she died in 2021, her belongings revealed more troubling details. Family and colleagues discovered notebooks filled with sketches, dates, and names that had never been included in her published work. Unlike her professional excavation reports, which followed academic standards, these private notes were fragmentary and cryptic. Some entries pointed to discoveries she had seen but never released. Others hinted at theories she had deliberately kept quiet. The fragments were controversial enough that people who saw them began to argue over why she had hidden them. Some believed she was protecting her reputation. By that time, critics were already mocking her for treating the Bible as a guide for archaeology. Releasing findings that were even more radical could have destroyed her career entirely. Others believed her silence had nothing to do with reputation. They argued she was protecting the state of Israel from discoveries that could undermine the nation's founding history. And then came the sharpest debate of all. Why did she finally confess? Some said she was pressured into it, that warnings from colleagues or officials forced her to say something before her death. Others argued that her conscience simply gave out, and she could no longer hold her secrets in. But many claim that even in her confession, she did not tell the full truth. They believe she revealed only part of what she knew, leaving the most dangerous details buried. The situation around her confession turned into another battlefield in her already controversial career. Academic rivals pointed to her behavior as proof that her ideas had gone too far and that she was unstable at the end. Even as the arguments raged over her final confession and what she truly revealed, one question kept surfacing. How did Eilat Mazar become so consumed by this mission in the first place? And why was she willing to risk her reputation and her sanity for it? The woman behind the shovel. Eilat Mazar did not arrive at her obsession by accident. She was born into archaeology. Her grandfather, Benjamin Mazar, was one of the giants of Israeli archaeology. He led the first large-scale excavations around the Temple Mount after 1967, when Israel took control of East Jerusalem. Those digs uncovered remains from multiple periods of Jerusalem's history, from the First Temple period to the Roman and Byzantine eras. Growing up in that shadow, Eilat absorbed the message that digging into the soil of Jerusalem was more than science. It was also a form of nation-building. That upbringing created in her a deep conviction that the stones of Jerusalem were waiting to confirm the stories she had read in the Bible. Unlike many of her peers who approached archaeology with skepticism about biblical texts, Mazar openly declared that the Bible was not just a book of faith. For her, it was a historical map. She argued that if you read it carefully, you could find clues pointing to real locations of events and buildings. In the academic world, this was seen as close to heresy. By the late 20th century, many archaeologists had moved away from biblical archaeology, preferring to focus only on what could be established through artifacts, pottery, and inscriptions. Mazar refused to accept that shift. Her approach made her a target. At conferences, colleagues dismissed her work as naive and unscientific. Some called her a biblical archaeologist, not as a title of honor, but as an insult. The phrase implied she was blinded by religion and incapable of critical thinking. A few went further and mocked her publicly, joking that she was not excavating history, but digging for fairy tales. Despite the ridicule, she refused to retreat. The most visible conflict came with scholars like Israel Finkelstein, one of the leading archaeologists in Israel. Finkelstein was a leading figure in what became known as the minimalist view. According to this school of thought, Jerusalem during the time of David was nothing more than a small settlement. From that perspective, David himself was at most a minor tribal chief, not the great monarch described in the Bible. This view suggested that the biblical accounts of David and Solomon were written much later, as a kind of national myth to give the Israelites a glorious past they never truly had. Mazar went after that view head-on. She described it as historical blindness, accusing her peers of deliberately ignoring evidence because it conflicted with their theories. Her clashes with Finkelstein and others became bitter academic feuds. Newspapers often picked up on these fights, portraying her as an extremist. Yet at the same time, religious groups celebrated her. To them, she was one of the few archaeologists willing to take the Bible seriously and defend it against those who dismissed it as myth. What made her fight even fiercer was her personal faith. She was not content to treat archaeology as a neutral search for data. She saw it as a mission to prove that Israel's founding history was true. She once said that the Bible gave her better leads than any archaeological survey. She knew she was outnumbered in the academic world, but she believed the ground beneath Jerusalem would prove her right. Her willingness to take that stand and to face mockery for it set the stage for the discoveries that would soon put her name at the center of global debates about King David, the Bible, and the history of Jerusalem. Despite all the criticism, she pressed forward. She gathered a team and began new excavations in the city of David. The bully that shouldn't exist. In 2005, during her excavation near the large stone structure in the city of David, Eilat Mazar and her team uncovered some of the most shocking finds of her career. As they sifted through soil layers, they began to find tiny lumps of hardened clay. At first glance, these fragments looked unremarkable, but careful cleaning revealed faint markings pressed into their surfaces. These were bullae, the ancient clay seals used by officials thousands of years ago to secure documents or containers. When someone wrote a message on papyrus or parchment, they tied it shut with a string, placed a lump of clay over the knot, and stamped it with a personal seal. The hardened clay preserved the name of the sender like a signature. One of the buli carried an inscription that read, "Belonging to Jehukal, son of Shelemiah." This was not a random name. It matched a man mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, identified as a royal official in the court of King Zedekiah during the final years of the kingdom of Judah. In Jeremiah 37:3, Jehukal was sent by Zedekiah to ask the prophet Jeremiah to pray for the city. Later, in Jeremiah 38:1, he appears again among the princes, who demanded that Jeremiah be silenced and thrown into prison for predicting Jerusalem's downfall. Soon another seal emerged. It read, "Belonging to Gedaliah, son of Pashur." He too appears in the same biblical account as another high-ranking courtier in Zedekiah's court, one of the men who worked alongside Jehukal against Jeremiah. Both men were part of the political faction that resisted Jeremiah's warnings and sought to suppress his voice. Their actions took place in the desperate years just before the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, when the city was under siege and its leadership was bitterly divided over how to respond. Finding one biblical name could be dismissed as coincidence. Finding two names, tied together both in the text and in the soil, was impossible to ignore. The discoveries did not stop there. Another bulla was uncovered that bore the name Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. This was no minor figure. Hezekiah is described in the Bible as one of the most significant kings of Judah, remembered for resisting Assyrian invasions and centralizing worship in Jerusalem. Holding in her hands a seal that directly carried his name was a moment of overwhelming emotion for Mazar. Witnesses later recalled how she lowered herself onto the dirt floor, clutching the piece of clay as a single tear ran down her face. After years of ridicule and accusations of chasing myths, she felt her effort had been vindicated. She sat there quietly, convinced that this was only the beginning, and that the ground around her still hid more names and more evidence. The meaning of these discoveries was enormous. For decades, critics had claimed that the Bible's stories were mostly invented, and that the people within them were no more real than characters in folklore. These bullae proved otherwise. They showed that the individuals named in Scripture were real men, alive and active in Jerusalem's political life. Their presence near the structure Mazar had identified as David's palace suggested a continuity of administration that tied biblical accounts to the physical landscape of the city. Critics, however, did not back down quietly. They argued that while the bullae were authentic, they belonged to a later period, around the 7th or 6th century BCE, long after David. They insisted that these finds could not prove the existence of a 10th century kingdom. But even they had to admit something they had long resisted. The bullae proved that names from the Bible were not fictional. They forced the scholarly world to accept that Jerusalem's biblical figures had left behind fingerprints pressed into clay. Still, Mazar wasn't done yet. What she uncovered next was too large to dismiss as a coincidence. The shocking pottery that dates to David. In the summer of 2015, Eilat Mazar began her excavation at the northern end of the city of David. It did not take long before her team uncovered something that did not belong in the expected timeline of Jerusalem's development. Beneath layers of later construction, they found monumental walls unlike any house, storage building, or small fortress known from that era. These walls were built on a scale that stunned even experienced archaeologists. They measured close to 6 meters in thickness and were constructed of dressed stones that had been cut and fitted with precision. In addition to the walls, there were signs of towers and large gateways, elements that did not fit the image of a 10th-century hilltop village. As her team carefully dug deeper, they began to recover pottery fragments embedded within the foundation layers. Pottery is one of the main tools archaeologists use to establish dates, since styles and shapes change in known patterns over time. The pottery found at the site matched the Iron Age II period, specifically the 10th century BCE. That was the period traditionally linked to the reign of King David. To Mazar, this was not a coincidence. The pottery provided a clear clock, and it placed the construction of the massive structure directly in David's time. The scale of the find reinforced her conviction. Some of the stones weighed several tons. They were not rough field stones piled together, but carefully cut blocks meant for monumental architecture. Smaller communities in the region had neither the manpower nor the wealth to cut and transport stones of that size. The presence of towers and gateway foundations further suggested an important administrative or royal building. The scale alone was evidence of centralized power, not the work of a village chieftain. At this stage, Mazar advanced what became known as her royal hypothesis. She argued that the building was not just an impressive fortress or administrative center. She concluded that it was the palace of King David, the same residence described in the book of Samuel. The Bible records that Hiram, king of Tyre, sent skilled builders, carpenters, and cedar wood to David in order to build a royal house. To Mazar, the use of foreign craftsmanship and expensive materials explained the unusual size and construction quality. It was during this time, according to later reports, that Mazar came across the shocking findings she never published in full. These were the discoveries she would only allude to years later in her final confession. If she had uncovered evidence of that scale so early in her excavation, then it meant she kept parts of it buried for decades. But before that, critics moved quickly to challenge her conclusions about David's palace. Some argued that the walls could belong to a later period, perhaps the 9th or 8th century BCE, when Jerusalem was expanding under other kings. Others suggested the structure could have been a fortress, a temple, or a large public building rather than a palace. Yet the combination of pottery dating, the monumental scale, and the placement at the highest point of the city of David matched the biblical description too closely to ignore. Even those who opposed her were forced to admit that the discovery was a problem for the minimalist view that Jerusalem in David's time was nothing more than a poor tribal village. The large stone structure shifted the debate. It was no longer just about whether David was real. The evidence pointed to a monumental complex in Jerusalem during his era. That meant a level of organization and wealth consistent with a kingdom. Her next step would take the argument even further. To strengthen her case, she turned to the massive terraced rampart running down the slope of the city of David. The Millo connection. On the steep slope of the city of David stands one of the most puzzling features of ancient Jerusalem, the stepped stone structure. Rising more than 20 meters high, it looks like a massive staircase of stone blocks built into the hillside. Archaeologists had known about it for over a century, but most dismissed it as little more than a retaining wall, designed to keep smaller houses from collapsing down the slope. Even so, its enormous size made it difficult to explain. Villages did not normally build such colossal supporting works. When Eilat Mazar began her excavation in 2005, she noticed something that other archaeologists had missed. The monumental walls of the large stone structure, which she identified as David's palace, seemed to connect directly into the top of the stepped stone structure. To her, this was not an accident. She argued that the stepped stone structure was actually the Millo, a fortification mentioned several times in the Bible. In 2 Samuel 5:9, the text states that after conquering Jerusalem, David fortified the city from the Millo inward. Later, in 1 Kings 9:15, the Bible records that Solomon also built and strengthened the Millo. The Hebrew word is thought to mean fill or terracing, describing a massive system of stone layers used to secure and fortify the hillside. If Mazar was right, the ruins on the slope were not a meaningless pile of stones. They were the very fortification system described in the books of Samuel and Kings. Even more importantly, David's palace was not a separate building sitting apart from the city's defenses. It was fused directly on top of the Millo. This meant the king's house was also part of Jerusalem's military heart. The palace was not only a residence of luxury, but also a fortress of security. The arrangement fit patterns known from other great kingdoms of the time. In Assyria, royal palaces were integrated into heavily fortified citadels. In Egypt, pharaohs lived in palace-temple complexes that combined administrative power with defense. By linking the palace to the Millo, Mazar was arguing that Jerusalem followed the same model. David's house was not built in isolation. It was part of a fortified system meant to dominate the city both politically and militarily. And this would lead her to one of her boldest claims ever. Jerusalem was no village. Eilat Mazar's next move was about redefining Jerusalem itself. After connecting the palace to the Millo, she began saying openly that the discoveries proved the city had been a functioning capital by the 10th century BCE. This was a direct attack on the minimalist claim that Jerusalem was nothing more than a dusty hillside settlement at that time. If her interpretation held, David could no longer be described as a tribal chief. He was a king, and Jerusalem was his seat of power. Her argument was straightforward. The scale of construction, the presence of foreign craftsmanship mentioned in biblical texts, and the evidence of administrative activity suggested a city that was organized, wealthy, and connected. A place capable of coordinating labor, importing materials, and building monumental architecture was not a village. It was a state capital. For Mazar, this was the central truth that her critics refused to accept. But the counterattacks from the scholarly community grew sharper. One line of criticism was demographic. Archaeologists pointed to population estimates for Judah in the 10th century. Based on surveys of rural sites, they argued the population was far too small to sustain an urban capital. A few thousand people, they claimed, could not have provided the labor force or resources to support a palace and major fortifications. To them, this was proof that Mazar's conclusions were inflated. Another argument focused on comparative archaeology. Critics noted that other cities in the region, such as Samaria or Megiddo, showed clearer evidence of monumental building in the 9th century, not the 10th. They claimed that Jerusalem only reached that level of development later, under different kings. By tying her finds to David, Mazar, in their eyes, was pushing the evidence back by a century without justification. There were also methodological challenges. Scholars accused her of relying too heavily on pottery dating, which, while useful, is not precise down to a single generation. Some claimed the layers she used to assign her discoveries to the 10th century could just as easily belong to the 9th. If that was the case, then her palace would not belong to David at all. It would belong to a later, less legendary king. Mazar dismissed these arguments as excuses. She argued that critics were so committed to minimizing the Bible that they overlooked what was right in front of them. To her, the size of the ruins and the dating of the pottery fit the biblical timeline too closely to be coincidence. She insisted that if Jerusalem were truly only a small village, there would be no need for the kind of monumental construction she had uncovered. The debate spilled well beyond archaeology. Religious leaders and nationalist groups seized on her claims, using them to argue that Israel's ancient past was not just real, but grander than many scholars admitted. Meanwhile, her critics doubled down, warning that archaeology was being politicized and that claims about David's Jerusalem were being weaponized in modern debates over land and history. Yet through all of this, Mazar never once retracted her claims. Even as her health began to fail, she stood by her interpretation that she had uncovered the palace of Israel's most famous king. Eilat Mazar's decline came at the same time that she became increasingly isolated in her professional life. Religious groups and nationalist circles continued to celebrate her as a defender of biblical history. But within mainstream archaeology, she was increasingly pushed aside. Funding became harder to secure, and she was invited less frequently to conferences. Rumors later circulated that during this period she was depressed and heavily burdened. The constant rejection from academic colleagues, combined with her illness, weighed on her deeply. Some said she seemed exhausted not just from cancer, but from carrying secrets that she had not yet shared. Those close to her suggested that she felt she could not leave the world without speaking at least part of what she believed she had discovered. It was just months before her death that she finally gathered a small team of trusted colleagues and revealed what she described as her biggest secret and most explosive finding. The darkest confession. According to sources, Mazar revealed that beneath the large stone structure, the building she had identified as David's palace, her team had come across evidence more disturbing than anything she had made public. Jerusalem had produced examples of unusual burials before, including deposits of dogs that archaeologists had linked to ritual practice. But what she found went beyond even that. The leaked accounts claimed that she had uncovered ritual deposits under the palace foundations. These included animal remains, traces of blood, and possibly even fragments of human bone. If true, the implication was that the palace had not only been raised on stone, but had been consecrated through ritual sacrifice. In ancient cultures, foundation sacrifices were sometimes performed as offerings to secure divine favor or to sanctify important structures. Mazar's claim, if accurate, suggested that such rites were carried out at the very heart of Israel's monarchy. The possible parallels in the Bible were chilling. Scripture is filled with references to blood rituals. Animal sacrifices were central to Israelite worship, yet the prophets condemned the forbidden rites of surrounding nations. The Canaanites were accused of child sacrifice, and the cult of Molech is described in the book of Leviticus as one of the abominations of the land. If David's palace was literally built on such deposits, it would blur the boundary between the practices the Bible condemns and the history it seeks to uphold. Scholarly reaction to this alleged confession has been divided. Some historians believe that if Mazar did uncover such remains, they may represent ritual activity predating David, possibly Jebusite practices incorporated into the foundations of the city. Others argue that even if sacrifices were made, they cannot be linked directly to David or his court, since foundation deposits were common throughout the ancient Near East and may have reflected cultural norms rather than individual choices. A small but vocal group, however, has suggested that the evidence, if genuine, points to a deliberate silence on Mazar's part. They argue that she feared releasing material that would undermine the central image of David as a divinely chosen king. The possibility that Israel's most famous monarch could be connected, however indirectly, to blood rituals is an idea that unsettles both religious and secular scholars. For religious communities, it clashes with the portrayal of David as the man after God's own heart. For academics, it raises the uncomfortable possibility that biblical Israel may not have been as distinct from its neighbors as often claimed. This is likely why Mazar kept it secret. Publishing such a claim during her lifetime would have brought immediate condemnation from religious leaders and further isolation from her peers. To her, the risk of destabilizing both faith and scholarship was too great. Yet in the end, she could not keep it buried. What do you think about Mazar's confession? Comment down below.